Thanks so much for being here. My name is Carlos de la Torre, and I am the director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. As part of the celebration of the center's 19th birthday, I am honored to chair this conversation. The aim of this event is to celebrate the accomplishment of development study approaches and the training of practitioners at the center, and to provide a space for a dialogue on the similarities and differences between different traditions. Our center has been at the forefront of critical development studies. I remember that when I was an undergraduate student at the center in the early 80s, the director at that time, Helen Safa, organized a very interesting conference on gender in the new International Division of Labor with people like Patricia Fernandez Kelly, Saskia Sassen, and others that focus on the role of women in the maquila industries in Mexico and the Caribbean. And Glaucio Suarez put together a conference on peasants and revolution, inviting Arturo Barman, Jeffrey Page, William Roseberry, among others. Our center has been a pioneer in theoretical work on gender and development, political ecology, post-development, and other critical traditions. In addition, the center has been an innovator in teaching critical development practitioners. Tropical Conservation and Development is an interdisciplinary program that brings together people in the natural and social sciences. And we are one of the few institutions that offers a master's program in development practice. Our panel this afternoon illustrates how our programs on development are truly interdisciplinary. We have agreed to have short presentations and to use most of the time to discuss the different traditions and their practical solutions. When doing development studies, the researcher, in addition to engage in rigorous scientific work, is forced to make normative choices about what does she mean by development, how development benefits some and not others, and what practical solutions are proposed and advocated. This is reflected in how development is thought and the values that are used to train practitioners. To make our conversation flow without interruptions, I will very briefly present all of our speakers. Marianne Schmink will be the first one. She is an anthropologist and one of the founders and leaders of the Tropical Conservation and Development Program in Concentration, and she will talk today on political ecology. The second speaker is Carmen Diana Deer. She's a feminist economist and a former director of the center. She will focus today on the traditions of gender and development. Next, Bette Louiset, who has a PhD in zoology and botany and is the director of the TCD program, will talk on empowering communities to advance conservation. Then Glenn Galloway, who has a PhD in civil culture and is the director of the MDP program, will present a talk entitled Teaching Sustainable Development. Then Susan Paulson, an anthropologist whose recent research focuses on post-development, will talk on degrowth and other post-development pathways. Without me continue to speak, please let me welcome Marianne Schmink. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos. It's great to be a part of this celebration of the center's 90th anniversary. I myself worked at the center for 40 years, almost half of that time. So it's really good to be a part of this. I would like to reflect here briefly on how my own field experience in the Amazon and my interactions with scientists in other disciplines here at UF led me to adopt a political ecology approach to the study and also to my teaching about development. I'm going to highlight two key shifts in my thinking that led to this perspective. One is my experience in the field forced me to see that the powerful grand narratives of development theory, such as modernization, world systems, and Marxian approaches to development, which dominated academic research in the 1970s, as important as they were, they often failed to capture the complexity of social change as it played out in particular places with particular histories and configurations. And the second shift was due to the growing realization for me as a social scientist of the key importance of ecological systems in such an important forested region like the Amazon. So these two insights led me to develop a political ecology approach that could help explain the contingent histories of different places and peoples in a way that could be understood and used by UF students in both social and ecological sciences. My field research in the Amazon began in 1975 with a focus on the expansion of the capitalist frontier into the region following highways that were being built by the military government in Brazil. And the invitation it had issued to investors from southern Brazil to exploit grazing lands, gold mines, and timber reserves, unleashing a big wave of occupation and deforestation in the region. Over more than a decade, my research focused on the impacts of that expansion and of the building of a new road through the jungle to this small riverine town of São Félix do Xingu, a remote place inhabited by people whose livelihoods still depended largely on collecting valuable goods from the forests and the rivers for their subsistence and for trade. Today, São Félix do Xingu is the capital of cattle raising and deforestation. The region was also home to several groups of the Kayapo Indians, and they were defending their traditional territories from invasion by loggers, gold miners, and cattle ranchers while trying to pressure the government to demarcate their reserves. For over a decade, along with my co-author and former Center Director Charles Wood, we followed the explosive changes that were taking place like something out of Wild West movies as the road forged ahead through the forest, and along the way, new settlements popped up as it went. And each of these towns centered on the battle over access to specific resources, a battle between the traditional populations and the many different actors who were attracted there by the opening up of the frontier. And there were many surprises along the way. There were persistent conflicts over land and minerals, pitting large ranchers and mining companies against small homesteaders and wildcat miners. And those outcomes were surprisingly unpredictable. Along those highways, so it was a dramatic shift from the rivers to the highways that were opening up the heart of the rainforest. And along those highways, thousands of small farmer migrants were moving in from other regions of Brazil, looking for land to homestead. These people were a big focus of our research, driven by the demands for agrarian reform in Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America. They were settling their families at great sacrifice in this new region with the hope of establishing small farms and escaping the traditional landholders who dominated society and controlled the access to land in other parts of Brazil. Sorry. What was less obvious to my social scientist eyes in those early days were the region's other non-human inhabitants and the incredibly complex ecosystems of the region's rivers and primal forests that were now under siege. Indigenous people and the rubber tappers and other traditional forest extractivists who had lived there over millennia or centuries had developed their own complex ways of making a living using the natural rhythms of the river and tides and the territorial diversity of the products of the rainforest. I learned about how the complex hydrological system of the Amazon produced flying rivers that fed the agricultural areas of southern Brazil, and the role of the forest in sequestering carbon. And as time went on, the migrant colonist farmers struggled to survive using their traditional agricultural practices that were based on replacing the forest with crops that failed over time to produce, like the previously exuberant forest did. So these diverse systems of forests and rivers inhabited by complex webs of animals and plants had their own dynamic that interacted in complicated ways with the human systems being imposed upon them. In our analysis of all the changes underway, the emerging paradigm of political ecology, focusing on the complex political factors driving environmental changes, provided a framework that made it possible to understand the complexity of change underway at international, national, regional, and local levels in each particular place at different moments in history, each with its particular history, actors, and natural resources. So far from being determined by the grand movements of capital or the sole struggle between two opposed social classes, the outcomes of the conflicts we observed depended on a very complex set of interacting struggles at different levels, some of them surprising, such as the success of the Kayapo Indians in expanding their territory during this period, despite all the pressures from powerful ranchers, loggers, and miners. And this earned them the cover photo on our book. So political ecology recognized the multiple levels that interacted to influence the outcome of sometimes indeterminate historical processes, encompassing not only the political and economic drivers of change, but also the sometimes unexpected agency of social groups engaged in struggles for their identity, their livelihood, their territory, their culture, or even their survival. We explicitly incorporated into these hierarchical models not only social, economic, and political systems, but also the different levels at which drivers from the biological system interacted with the human systems to influence the outcomes in both. Combining social and ecological systems into one framework of analysis was a key strategy for the TCD program, which in the 1980s began experimenting with combining graduate students from both fields into the same graduate classes. So we didn't have a common theoretical and conceptual background. The PE framework, the political ecology frameworks, provided a means to encompass the major questions and concerns of researchers at a variety of levels in both social and biological sciences, allowing them to understand and discuss these issues within a much broader frame of reference. We literally had students map their research questions onto these models to explore how their specific research fit into broader questions of conservation and development. We developed and discussed many versions of these frameworks, including here on the right, a political ecology mobile. This mobile consisted of cards representing different levels of determinations and interactions that were connected by strings, and that allowed them to swing and move. And this was a really great way to illustrate that change is always in motion at different levels in different ways. The mobile was invented by a group of graduate students, including Franklin Paniagua, who's now Costa Rica's Vice Minister for Natural Resources and the Environment. And I made many versions of the mobile in different languages through the years to use in teaching, fastening them to a coat hanger to hang in the classroom. Dealing with levels of interaction could also be adapted with interesting paradigms being used in the ecological sciences, such as the adaptive cycle, which was developed by UF ecologists Buzz Holling and Lance Gunderson. And that incorporated cyclical change and shifts to altogether new systems through changes at different levels. So we were able to apply this framework to understand cycles of socio-political change in the Amazon, such as this model of the region during the rubber boom at the turn of the 20th century, showing a period of expansion in migration and then a collapse when Asian sources of rubber began to be produced, leading to some new features in the subsequent system based on new national policies. And then this model of the period under the military government and the transition to democracy and to the new socio-environmentalism that emerged. So you had the frontier expansion period that I described, then crises with deforestation and land conflicts, the emergence of social movements, and changing national policies in the direction of more socio-environmental movements, all of which is now unfortunately being reversed under Brazil's current president. This trajectory of understanding that started as research inspired by the grand development narratives of the 1960s and 1970s evolved into my understanding of development as political ecology, complex, indeterminate, variable, and contested, and inextricably linked, at least in the Amazon, to parallel complex ecological systems of change and adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Carmen Diana?
Okay, thank you. I've been deeply involved in historical research for the last few years. So my approach is going to be to look at the history of the field of gender and development at UF over the past 50 years or so. The field of gender and development was born in the 1970s from what was, at the time, a quite radical proposition that women had been excluded from the development process. Moreover, in many cases, women had been harmed by development interventions. The goal, as thus said at the first UN Conference on Women in Mexico in 1975, was thus to incorporate women into development. And that was the birth of what was then called the WID approach. Well, from the very start, what came to be called the mainstream approach was subject to criticism from every angle for its lack of attention to capital accumulation or the questions of the broader political economy, to the need to study men as well as women, hence the shift from women to gender, to the need to incorporate the environment and ecological issues, as well as an intersectional perspective of race, gender, and class. Well, center and affiliate faculty and students have been important contributors to this field. And the approaches that we've seen at UF have been as diverse as the field itself. When I tried to come up with one constant across the years, is the multi and interdisciplinary focus of the fields, and particularly of the collaborations these have led to across UF. I want to share an anecdote that some of you might know about how Marianne and I first met, since this goes back to the origin of the field and to later developments at UF. In 1974, Helen Safa, who was then at Rutgers University, and two other pioneers in the field of gender and development, June Nash and Elsa Cheney, organized the first research training workshop on feminine perspectives on social science research in Latin America. And this was held in Cuernavaca, Mexico. The aim was to encourage graduate students to apply the insights of feminism to social science analysis, and in particular, to write dissertations on women. Well, Marianne and I were among the 30-some students who spent 2 months locked in a motel outside of Cuernavaca, studying with the pioneers, both from Latin America, the US, and elsewhere in the field of women in development. And I guess that we're probably among the success stories in the sense that we did do dissertations that focused on women. Marianne on household strategies in urban Brazil, and my own on peasant reproduction strategies in rural Peru. Well, you know, we never would have guessed at that point in time that Helen, Marianne, and I would all end up at UF and retire here. Marianne was the first to come to UF in 1979, and her research interests at that time followed two tracks. On the one hand, she continued to be engaged in research on urban women, involved in a large-scale project on women in urban services in Latin America. Then, as part of her focus to the Amazon and her leadership role in the Amazon Research and Training Program, she was shifting, of course, to rural women as well as farming systems. And I'll talk about that more in a second. Meanwhile, in 1980, the next year, Helen Safa arrived at the center as the very first female director. As I mentioned, she was already one of the pioneers in the field, was the co-editor of two of the classic textbooks with Jude Nash, Sex and Class in Latin America, and later Women and Change in Latin America. Well, her focus in the 1980s and beyond was on the intersection of race, gender, and class. She was one of the early contributors in that field, a perspective that she brought to issues ranging from the International Division of Labor to migration. And these themes are very much evident in several center conferences of that period. Carlos mentioned a couple of them in the research and training programs, and also in the new course offerings at the center in the 1980s, when there were finally regular course offerings in women in development, gender, and development. Well, by the mid-1980s, there was a growing network of researchers at UF who focused on agriculture. And in 1984, the very first formal program in this field was organized, called the Women in Agricultural Program, under IFAS international programs with the collaboration of Latin American studies and African studies. Shortly after, this became the Women in Agricultural Development Program, or WIAD, and it was to offer one of the first graduate certificates across campus for interdisciplinary work in this field. Pioneers in this effort were, of course, Marianne, Sandra Rousseau, Susan Potts, Anita Spring, among others. Among the many international conferences and workshops they were to offer, one particularly stands out because I think this really put UF on the map in the field of gender and development. And that was the 1986 conference on gender issues in farming systems research and extension that resulted in the influential edited volume by Marianne, Susan Potts, and Anita Spring. This whole initiative in the conference reflected the strength of UF at the time in international farming systems research and the successful efforts by the WIAD group to incorporate this focus on inter-household relations into the broader research focus, let's say, of IFAS. The next important initiative was in the 90s through MERGE, managing ecosystems and resources with gender emphasis, a real mouthful. So it's just important to remember MERGE. This was, as far as I can tell, the first such gender program that was based at the center. And it was under TCD and the leadership of Marianne with John Dane as program manager. It was the structure of the program was that it was to function as a network of organizations that focused on gender community participation in natural resource management initially in Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil. And the main activities were related to gender training and producing case studies of best practices, of which I understand the sixth case study just recently was published. Well, Marianne has mentioned to me how MERGE was really the incubator for much of the TCD methodology. And it was also characterized by another aspect of TCD, its broad participation of US faculty and students across disciplines and in their home countries, and how these links are forged and maintained. Among the UF participants were Karen Kiner, Sandra Rousseau, Lizette Stahl, and some of the key partners were again Susan Potes, Avesita Chichon, and our own Susan Paulson in her pre-UF life. By the mid-1990s, UF Women's Studies program had evolved to the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research. And at that time, the WIAG Development Certificate evolved into the GAP, the Graduate Certificate for Gender, the Environment, and Agricultural program. And it was moved to the Center for Women's Studies. In Latin American studies itself, while we were offering courses related or in gender and development, we didn't develop a gender specialization in the MALIS program itself until 2006. I arrived at UF as center director in 2004, bringing a feminist economic perspective. And Florence Babb, a feminist anthropologist, was hired shortly thereafter at the Center for Women's Studies. And it was Florence that actually developed this specialization for us. Shortly after that, we were complemented by the hiring of Pilar Useche in 2007, and we began collaborating on student dissertations related to projects on intra-household distribution of assets and wealth, and an initiative on gender and climate change. Over the past decade, we've had a number of other new initiatives. Under the leadership of Sandra Rousseau, the Gender and Development Working Group on campus was revived with new energy as a campus-wide initiative bringing together graduate students and faculty on a weekly basis. Within both TCD and in our newest program, MDP, there's been an increasing number of students writing dissertations, theses, and doing practicums in the field of gender and development. Let me conclude then with the changing of the guard at the center. The hiring of new folks with a gender focus, Susan Paulson, Tanya Saunders, and Rebecca Henson. Susan came in 2014. She's a longtime contributor to the fields of WID and gender, environment and development, political ecology, and she's brought a new complement to gender studies with her focus on masculinities. Tanya, who was initially based on women's studies and helped to further that relationship, has developed a new specialization at the center, I think replacing the former gender studies, called Race, Diaspora, Gender, and Sexuality. And Rebecca Henson, who joined us as a joint appointment with sociology in 2017, has been doing important research on sexual harassment as well as masculinities. In sum, UF researchers and students at the center have contributed to almost all the topics of attention in the gender and development field, and certainly have represented all the different approaches. Perhaps the longest and most enduring has been in the applied field of agriculture, natural resources, and environment. But I think we've also contributed greatly over the years to a political economy perspective in the integration of the issues of gender, class, race, and, and ethnicity that a feminist lens has also brought to critical development studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen Diana. Betty?
Thanks, Carlos. And it's really just a great honor to be here with everyone today, and to also to follow Marianne and Carmen Diana Deere, who really kind of set up my talk pretty well, because I'd like to focus, so we think about critical development in the center, I'd like to focus on the role that the Tropical Conservation and Development Program, plays in sort of, in this case, advancing conservation. And I'm going to approach it pretty much from my own background. I'm a natural scientist. I'm an ecologist that has worked in Latin America since the early 1980s. And I came to the University of Florida in 2011. And the TCD story really begins a long time ago in the Center for Latin American Studies, beginning when Charles Wagley arrived to the University of Florida after his career at Columbia University. And Marianne Schmink came in the later 1970s and began to teach an interdisciplinary seminar focused on issues in the Amazon. And during the kind of the precursors of the TCD program included the Lowland South America program that Charles Wagley was involved in and funded graduate students, 1972 and 1980, the Amazon Research and Training Program during the 80s, and then the formal TCD program, which began in the late 1980s. And as Marianne has said, when she reflected on her own background and how she came upon political ecology, it was during those years in the 1980s when Marianne Schmink and others sort of from the social science side reached out across the University of Florida and connected up with the natural scientists, the wildlife ecologists and foresters during the 1980s, and began to have these conversations. And I must say that during those times, I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. And as a natural scientist, when we thought about protected areas, we thought about protected areas from very much this sort of the biodiversity conservation standpoint that, that people are a problem. They're not part of the solution. I mean, that was the dogma of the times in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Now, the University of Florida had a very strong international program in wildlife ecology. And so I think that they recognized also, like Marianne did, that in order to sort of advance conservation, that we really had to start thinking not about people as a problem, but also include people as part of the solution in furthering our goals for biodiversity conservation. And at that time in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, when you thought about it, there was a lot of theoretical ecology out there that, again, never incorporated the sort of the socioeconomic and other kinds of components. They thought about, how do we design nature reserves? Do we build one big, large reserve, or do we have a bunch of small reserves that might be connected? What's going to be the outcome for protecting most of the species? Again, without thinking about the human and cultural components associated, with these very complex systems, as Marianne was talking about. So what emerged then was the Tropical Conservation and Development Program at the University of Florida, with a mission to bridge the theory and practice to advance biodiversity conservation, sustainable resource use, and human well-being by training the next generation of professionals to bridge theory and practice, and importantly, learn across disciplines, to have problem-centered research, and to work in these learning and action networks that characterize the TCD program. So I'm going to give you a little bit of TCD 101 during this talk. And so what is the TCD program? It's a research and training program at the graduate level within the Center for Latin American Studies. And we like to think about ourselves as adding value to graduate students at the UF. Now, in our program, graduate students do not get their degree in TCD. They can get a graduate certificate, but they get their master's or their PhD in their home departments. And we collaborate with more than 25 departments across campus. We emphasize learning across disciplines to achieve a real holistic understanding of the integrated socioeconomic, cultural, political, and ecological systems. We build capacity to be able to critically evaluate scientific evidence and other knowledge systems that relate to conservation and development. And we foster, importantly, collaboration and communication skills, the strategies that are needed to work with a diverse set of stakeholders and to build partnerships, including learning how to work together in teams. Now, I'm highlighting these things on this slide because just a couple of days ago, Phil Williams talked about the 4 principles that really underlie the center. He talked about interdisciplinary approaches, this really deep contextual understanding of cultures and the environmental systems, this ability to, conduct teaching and scholarship that lead to having a positive impact through problem-oriented research, and the real importance of collaboration and partnerships. Well, that really characterizes the TCD program. We also create spaces for our community to come together, to collectively learn from each other, and to try to think about, problems in conservation and development from a variety of perspectives. We provide funding for students. But the important part of this talk is that we are a community, and we are a community of faculty and students and alumni and partners around the world. And we are conducting projects, working with partners. We get external grants, and Carmen Diana just mentioned the MERGE program. And we lead these often in conjunction with our network of alumni and others, including, for example, the Amazon Dams International Network, the Governance and Infrastructure of the Amazon Project, which is an ongoing project right now, funded by the Moore Foundation. We also bring together practitioners and scientists and students in particular workshops and conferences that often address pressing issues of the day. But importantly, we have this huge network outside of UF that includes over 500 alumni and partners, which provide real great opportunities for us at UF, our students, our faculty, as well as for interactions among our network partners to work together to try to make change going forward. And I just show some of them here, partners from World Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Conservation Society, Conservation International, among others, IPE, the Moore Foundation, and so forth. So how do we get it done? What is really the change here that we do? And right now I've just added and development, and I put and in italics just to recognize Emilio Bruna, who said at the time, that's a revolutionary ampersand, because natural scientists would never have put those 2 words together back, in the late 1970s or early 1980s. So how do we do it? It's the approach that we take. This is sort of our framework that was published in Conservation Biology in 2006, led by Karen Kiner. And it's a matter of students come with all kinds of skills and experiences. They come from NGOs, they come from government, they come from working in Peace Corps in rural environments. We enhance those skills. We give them opportunities to practice those skills so that when they do go to the field, they're comfortable working with a diverse set of partners. They can deal with conflict. They can deal with facilitating conversations among multiple stakeholders, of communicating with a variety of different peoples and cultures and so forth. So there's professional skills. There's the interdisciplinary studies that Marianne talked about, where we bring social scientists and natural scientists together, and they learn to think about things in new way and new perspectives and explore the theories that come out of both of those disciplines. And they learn to communicate with each other as well. And it's also about going to the field and applying that and conducting problem-oriented research, often together with our partners and in conjunction with the communities in which we work. Karen Kiner and Eduardo here are shown in Western Amazonia in Acre, where TCD has worked since its inception in extractive reserves with local communities and local universities to sort of advance the resource use in that region. So if I come back again and look at it from the natural science perspective, I would say that the TCD approach has really fundamentally changed the way that the kinds of questions that we've asked and, the outcome of those sorts of questions. And, I'm going to give just one or two examples here. I know I'm kind of close to being where I should be ending up, but I want to talk about just a couple of examples. Santiago Espinosa got his PhD in 2012, a very interdisciplinary project where he was addressing sort of the issue of jaguar conservation, hunting, bushmeat extraction in the Amazon. He comes from a natural science background, and he developed a project that really integrated the two to try to come up with solutions and recommendations for how the Guarani, an indigenous community, can monitor their wildlife and how they can manage those resources. And the TCD program is full of these examples of natural scientists like Paula Pinheiro coming in to develop and understand the governance of the resource extraction of Pirarucu, one of the world's largest freshwater fish. And Michael Esbach working with the COFAN and being able to demonstrate that the COFAN's adaptive management system of their wildlife is actually very effective, contrary to what the ministry thought and what NGOs thought about their management of these resources. These individuals, who all came from natural science background, have really, transformed the way they went to the field, asked their questions, and the kinds of outcomes that they were able to have as a result of the research. So that's sort of the advancing conservation, empowering communities to work basically in new ways. And with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Betty. Glenn Galloway, please.
Okay. So can you see my slide well here? Well, thank you, Carlos. This is an honor for me to be part of this panel. And just listening to the prior presentations, it just becomes immensely clear why the MDP program ended up being UF ended up being selected for an MDP program. So what I'm going to be doing is I am the director of the Master of Sustainable Development Practice program, and I'm going to give a presentation about what we have learned about teaching sustainable development here in the center. Let's see here, I'm trying to get this to work. So the MDP program is relatively new. Around 10 years ago, the MacArthur Foundation supported an International Commission on Education for Sustainable Development. And the idea was to try to understand what could be done to improve the education of development practitioners. And so when the MacArthur Foundation created a call on the basis of the results of the International Commission, UF, who had, as we have seen in the previous presentations, was carrying out the TCD program, thought this was a wonderful opportunity to not only offer a certificate, but also to offer an advanced degree, a master's degree in sustainable development practice. And something like 85 universities around the world presented proposals to the MacArthur Foundation, and 10 were selected originally for receiving a grant to establish an MDP program, and UF was one of those that was selected. So the situation now is that there are 38 universities around the world that have MDP programs. In North America, we have 10, and you can see the ones that are in the United States here to the right. The program continues to grow, and we've, of course, generated a lot of lessons and learned through this experience, this global experience. So the International Commission what they found was very consistent with many of the experiences that University of Florida had already had. To be a good, effective development practitioner, it was important to have an interdisciplinary understanding of development. So they suggested or recommended the creation of a master's program built around these 4 pillars: social sciences, natural sciences, health sciences, and management. And to design a core curriculum that included these courses in these 4 pillars, but also leaving some flexibility for elective courses and a strong field piece in which students would put to use the knowledge and skills that they learned from their courses and so forth. So I want to just show quickly here, this is where the MDP students in the last 10 years have carried out their field practicums. It's the capstone experience of the master's degree. The little red blobs are from summer of 2020, and you can see that most of them are concentrated in the US, and that's because the pandemic restricted travel in 2020. But also it became clear when there was a shift from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals that development challenges aren't restricted to the tropics, to Africa and South America, but we have plenty of development challenges right here in the US. So it's become increasingly clear that if students want to work in sustainable development, we have plenty of things that students could do right here in the US or in Europe or in other so-called more developed places in the world. I guess this shows kind of the balanced approach that we think is very important in teaching sustainable development. We recognize that students need a balanced combination of knowledge, skills, and aspects of professional behavior. You could imagine you could have a professional that's very knowledgeable, but without the appropriate skills, they're not going to be very effective as development practitioners. And you could even have someone very knowledgeable and skillful, but if they don't practice ethically, or if they don't have good interpersonal skills or cultural sensitivity, they also are not going to be very effective as development practitioners. So we look for a balance among these different dimensions of their programs. So now I'm going to just go quickly through some of the important lessons and experiences of the MDP program. First of all, the students that come into the program have an enormous diversity of interests. And again, you can think in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, which beyond the area of conservation and development, it includes things like food security, gender equality, climate change, marine environments, sustainable infrastructure, sustainable cities. It's a very, very diverse agenda. And our students end up working in a lot of those different areas embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals. So that implies that you need opportunities for personalized learning and also opportunities for specialization that complement the core curriculum. So in UF, that implies the importance of cross-departmental collaboration, which has already been fostered through the TCD program. And that's to expand the elective courses available to our students, but also to broaden the participation of faculty on supervisory committees. And it's interesting to note that to date, 85 faculty members have served on MDP student committees. What we have found is that through the years, students really appreciate the exposure to the diversity that's inherent in what we call the cohort model, because a lot of the courses are taken together by the students that come in at the same time. And I'm just going to give you another picture of the diversity. This is the undergraduate degrees of students that have come into the program. So you can see that it's incredibly diverse. And of course, the bigger the letters, the more students that we've had in that particular profession. So anthropology is right there in the middle. which may have surprised many people that when they were designing the MDP program. And the diversity doesn't stop there. We've also learned that MDP students aspire to contribute to sustainable development in diverse ways and using different approaches. And you can see some of them listed there. I'm not going to read through those, but everything from involvement of the private sector to community processes to more social activism, degrowth, or post-development pathways. There's all kinds of ways our students want to contribute to sustainable development. Now, these different approaches do not work in isolation. There are many connections between them. So yeah, it's not like if somebody's working in corporate sector leadership that they're not going to be interested in bioeconomy or green economy. So teaching sustainable development involves accommodating and critically discussing these different perspectives and approaches. We've also, and this has come through in the previous presentations, we've recognized the importance that our students gain a broad understanding of sustainable development challenges. We've talked about the importance of cross-scale and cross-disciplinary implications of this type of work. And a lot of times in the MDP programs, they talk about this term integration that's inherent in sustainable development. And that's across sectors, disciplines, and stakeholders. This we've seen in the previous presentations as well. And also, like within the SDGs, the linkages, the potential for synergies, and also trade-offs that are exist within the SDGs. And then there's also a temporal dimension that thinking across long, medium, and short-term perspectives. Another important thing to understand is that students, when they do gain a broader understanding of complex nature of sustainable development, this can be quite insightful, but also it can be overwhelming to aspiring practitioners. So because many times the space that they work in is quite narrow because of the short-term nature of sustainable development initiatives that have limited funding and also limitations in knowledge and so forth. So what are the strategies that we teach our students is to invest time to learn about the context and conceptual underpinnings of their work, and also when possible to contribute to ongoing processes and initiatives. With regards to the field practicum, the capstone experience of the MDP, MDP students commit to agreed upon deliverables with a host organization. They develop a proposal, they secure IRB approval, they develop an extensive final report. So through this process, they gain knowledge, they have the opportunity to practice an array of skills and conduct themselves in challenging professional contexts. And the skills include planning and application of methods, analytical skills, and also writing and communication. When MDP students come to UF, and in other universities around the nation, they want to get involved outside the classroom. So another important part of teaching sustainable development is to identify opportunities that students can link into or encourage students to create their own initiatives. And there's just a list there of the kind of things that MDP students have been involved in here in UF. Finally, I have just a couple slides on feedback that we've received from alumni on key knowledge areas that they consider as in demand by their employers or areas that are gaining in importance. Again, this is consistent with what we've been discussing, the importance of having the ability to do abstract, cross-disciplinary and cross-sectoral thought. Systems thinking is in red because that was something that was not envisioned by the original International Commission, but it's something quite important. And then sustainability, environmental topics like climate change, governance, globalization, and you can see the others listed below to a lesser degree. In the areas of skills, they highlighted the importance of research and related analytical skills, which are important for monitoring and evaluation, communication skills and cultural sensitivity, critical thinking and problem solving, project management, and others that you can see listed below. Just drawing on a couple other studies. This was on the right, a study of 2,500 development professionals by DevEx, and another study of 28 NGO managers with over 10 years experience. And you can see that there's an alignment with many of the outcomes in areas that were identified as being key in our study. So it seems like there's a considerable agreement among these different analyses. So in conclusion, teaching sustainable development involves providing students with guidance and opportunities to acquire knowledge, develop skills, and cultivate strong and appropriate social and emotional skills. Involves broad faculty support and cross-departmental collaboration, which has made this program what it is today in UF, is the willingness of faculty to contribute to the program, and that our students gain knowledge and insights into the complexity of sustainable development and draw on this understanding in their careers as practitioners. Combining a shared core set of courses with opportunities for specialization has been a very good strategy to inculcate a broad understanding of sustainable development challenges in our students, but also develop skills and knowledge in specific areas of interest. Finally, since the field continues to evolve, we've seen the involvement over the last 30 or 40 years in the prior presentations. We must instill the importance of lifelong learning in our students, and I would say in ourselves as well.
Nice.
So, thank you.
Thank you. Susan?
Great. Thank you, Carlos, for convening this conversation, and Marianne, Carmen, Betty, Glenn for moving the world in such courageous ways. So building on this amazingly rich history described so far, I'm going to now turn toward future horizons. Development policies, projects, discourses have taken many forms. What they share is a linear conception of history in which all societies progress from diverse forms of underdevelopment toward a desired end called development. If climate crises have a silver lining, it may be the power to provoke residents of high emission countries to question the portrayal of our own societies as developed in the sense of full grown, perfected. As Glenn Galloway explained, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals encourage that questioning as expressed in a 2015 report. Growing social divides combined with overuse of resources show that today's high-income countries should not serve as role models for the developing world. In terms of sustainability, all countries are developing countries. So in this new paradigm, what can we learn from pathways conceived as post-development or alternative to development? They take many forms. Some from which I've been learning together with students I advise are agroecology, zapatistas, and buen vivir. Starting in the 1990s, I accompanied Agruco in Bolivia, Pratec in Peru, seeking alternatives to the Green Revolution by supporting local knowledges, ritual agroecology practices, visions less dominated by dualism and anthropocentrism. These and fellow organizations are now interconnected across the region and in fact the world in Via Campesina and other networks. The emergence of Zapatista Revolutionary Front from indigenous bases that shocked the world in 1994 has continued with a quarter century of struggles, not demanding greater share of national power, but instead seeking autonomy to forge different futures. In the 21st century, long evolving Andean traditions that foreground eco-social well-being have been articulated around the term buen vivir and incorporated into a range of policies, programs, even national constitutions. All these movements have sparked passionate debate and experimentation. They've also provoked negative reactions from powers that be. As we've learned from Marianne Schmink's long-term research and from several thousand conflicts documented in the Environmental Justice Atlas, people living with very low incomes often organize to resist initiatives for economic development in the form of mines, dams, oil wells, ranches, factories, plantations, highways designed to traverse the Tipnis Preserve in Bolivia or expand agribusiness and tourism in Chiapas. And as Betty Loisel communicated earlier, over the decades, numerous students and faculty involved in UF's Tropical Conservation and Development Program have studied and written about these struggles and these environmental conflicts. It is awareness of these realities that prompted the emergence in the North of degrowth movements working to reduce global impacts of wealthy societies with the goal of allowing others more autonomy to apply their own resources to pursue their own visions of well-being. Degrowth aims to make way for healthier futures in three ways. First, decreasing quantities of material and energy used by wealthy economies. Second, by curbing personal and cultural obsessions with growth. And third, by reorienting values, institutions, worldviews around care and regeneration of humans and other nature. Like all the center-based programs described by my colleagues today, degrowth integrates methods, ideas from natural and social science and humanities. Its basis is the science of thermodynamics. As theorized by Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen in the 70s, popularized by Herman Daly, societal metabolism transforms material and energy into goods and services in processes that convert low entropy stocks of resources into high entropy waste. As seen in Marianne's wonderful mobile models, those dynamics influence nutrient cycles, hydrological cycles, climate change. So degrowth analyzes the biophysical interactions amongst socioeconomic systems, ecosystems, and earth systems, just like that mobile, Marianne. We ask the question, how do eco-footprints increase in relation to GDPs? How do uneven flows of material and energy across value chains end up increasing profits in some places while increasing entropy in others? How do global socioeconomic trends correlate with breaches of planetary boundaries? Another challenge that degrowth and Latin American studies share is addressing coloniality from the North. Latin American and Caribbean thinkers and activists have pushed the world to address coloniality and core periphery dependency. Marisol de la Cadena, Fernando Enrique Cardoso, Eduardo Galeano, Arturo Escobar, Franz Fanon, Maria Lugones, Aníbal Quijano, Walter Mignolo, Raúl Prebisch, Sylvia Winter, as well as innumerable others exercising forms of sovereignty across the region, have provoked difficult conversations amongst US and other scholars. Critics of colonialism and development have long denounced harm done to cultural groups labeled underdeveloped. Mali's former Minister of Culture, Aminata Traoré, describes le viol de l'imaginaire, the rape of the imaginary, that narrows African horizons of possibility to a white man's dream. It's been even more difficult to think critically about harm done along the way to developed worldviews, like my own. Societies whose political economic domination have occasioned global dissemination of our supposedly superior languages and lifestyles have in the process suffered a crippling colonization of our own imaginaries. From cartoons, school books, political speeches, Hollywood films, we've been seduced into complicity with development dreams that contribute to outcomes that are sometimes ethnocentric, ethnocidal, ecocidal. So degrowth is about seeking paths that people positioned as colonizers, labeled as developed, can follow toward broader, healthier global horizons. Heightened awareness of our own historical positions at the heart of colonizing growth has led US and Europeans to work on decolonizing our own minds and desires, to insist that wealthy countries put our own houses in order before intervening to fix the rest of the world, on whose backs we grew. Degrowth authors criticize trickle-down and charity discourses that make it seem as if growth of wealthy economies helps the global South, and instead argue that high-income countries would do better to focus on repaying ecological debt and reversing unequal flows of capital, resources, waste. In short, high consumption societies must degrow to allow for increased consumption and especially greater autonomy among the poorest. Long inspired by Carmen Diana Deere, by Marianne, others, I'm particularly interested in ways that colonial expansion and development have operated through dissemination of specific systems of race, class, and gender. Industrial capitalism emerged and has continued to co-evolve with racial systems that facilitate access to indigenous lands, to enslaved and underpaid labor. Gender has also been harvested to increase productivity and profit. As expectations of masculinity shift toward performance of long hours of paid work, and femininities towards unpaid work, regenerating labor capacities and reproducing socialized labors. So these systems have been widely critiqued for engineering hierarchy, exploitation, and exclusion, including in that camp that Marianne and Carmen Diana participated in. But now, the question that we're looking at now is how can these be reoriented around care and regeneration of life, adapted to support greater equity and autonomy? One good strategy is mutual learning and alliance building among movements, South and North, toward decolonization, deracialization, depatriarchization, and degrowth. Insofar as all these D movements are about resisting imposition of certain universal models, their partner pluriverse is about honoring existing diversity, nourishing what Zapatistas call a world where many worlds can thrive. Note how resistance against political and cultural domination is intertwined with practical strategies for making life. In Gandhi's message, live simply so others may simply live. In Via Campesina's aim, food sovereignty. In the Yasuni cry, leave the oil in the soil. Healthy futures depend on biocultural diversity nourished by these and other visions. That is why efforts to learn from diverse Latin American worlds, ongoing in our LAS Center, is so vital to equitable and resilient futures. Thank you.
Thanks so much for these excellent presentations. I have learned a lot about the history of and the controversies of development, not only in general, but the role of the center in being a hub of thinking about that. I had the hunch that that was the case, but I didn't know the exact details. So, you know, for me, this has been extremely fascinating. So let me go into some commonalities that I saw in the different presentations, and then let me try to ask some questions that you can address. And then you can also, you know, without following what I'm saying, you can engage with each other. So, for me, one of the fundamental premises of all of the talks is the abandonment of the great narratives, all of the teleological views of that history has a telos, a direction. That will be the approaches of modernization, theory, Marxism, etc. And so that's one of the first things. The other is interdisciplinarity in all of the forms that you can have interdisciplinarity. And then the integration of different forms of resistance and oppression that have to do with gender, that have to do with social class, that have to do with race, etc. And the collaboration between people in the North and in Latin America. Now, after we say that, including, I mean, the collaboration, the incorporation of indigenous knowledge. After saying that, I have one question. I would like to explore a bit the different prognosis, the different solutions that the different approaches that we have been talking about have to offer. I mean, what are the difference, for instance, between political ecology and degrowth? What are the difference between a feminist economics perspective and degrowth? That's one question. A second question, and here I'm going to sound like a troglodyte from the traditional left, but which is a very strong critique to notions that you can have degrowth, that you can have preservation of the environment in poor countries. I mean, President Correa of Ecuador, somebody I never liked, but you know, his words were, we cannot be millionaires, we cannot be poor people sitting in a sack of gold. I mean, we have to produce wealth and then we have to redistribute. So there is a class, ethnic and geographical references to all of these models that want to preserve the environment at the cost of poverty that exists in these nations. And then finally, what are we missing by abandoning the grand narratives? I mean, I found fascinating all of the examples of local struggles, of local forms of struggle, yeah, of environmental struggle and struggles to create a better world. But grand narratives had an aim, a normative aim, to present and to provide a different alternative use of the future and of the world. I mean, what are we losing by abandoning these great narratives? So let me stop there, and why don't let's follow the order of the presentation. So Marianne, Carmen Diana, Betty, Glenn, and Susan.
Okay, thank you, everybody. This has been really interesting to see all this put together, and thank you, Carlos, for your comments. Yeah, so I was the one who started out with talking about abandoning those grand narratives. And I would like to say that all the frameworks, political ecology, and other frameworks that I have found useful for understanding what's happening and for teaching about the complexity of development are not as strong as those grand narratives in terms of as theory. So they're actually much more useful to understand something after it's happened. They're not very good at predicting what is the prime mover that is leading to this change. So I think that's something that we have lost by abandoning them. And I think that in many cases, in general terms, they were correct in predicting what the long-term effects would be of development for the reasons that they discussed. But because of the inability to deal with the complexity of different levels, and they did not actually weren't able to encompass the complexity, and the fact that those theories only explain part of the picture. And the part that they don't explain is really important, because that is the social agency and the agency even of the natural environment that had to be left out of the analysis in order for the big narrative to be coherent. So I think there is a trade-off there. And I often told my students that these frameworks, particularly in an interdisciplinary setting, are very useful for a dialogue, for understanding how these pieces fit together and how they may be difficult to predict. But they are not as useful in explaining or predicting outcomes. So that to me is one of the problems. I wanted to just show a t-shirt that we made for the MDP a few years ago. Let me see if you can see this. Can you see it? It says, "It's complicated and context dependent." So I used to wear this in the class I taught on development. It's not a very satisfying answer because it's really kind of weaseling out of the answer. We don't know because it's complicated and it depends on the context. But that's the truth. So it's some combination of having in mind, and I think all of us had these more theoretical perspectives in our minds in looking at the complexity. So for example, I always am going to be looking for the power differences based in political and economic interests as a big part of the picture. Why? Because I know from the grand theories that that's going to explain a good deal of what's happening. But I'm also going to have to be looking at the practices people develop, the identities and the ideas that they put forward, like buen vivir, and how those are linked to different cosmologies and totally different views of life and development. So those things that are left out turn out to be some of the most important things that are left out of the explanations from the grand theories. I'll just stop with that.
Okay, I guess I'm next. You know, I would say that we've got to be careful and thinking that we're past the grand narratives, not to confuse that with getting rid of really strong frameworks, analytical frameworks for analyzing the world. And when I think about what feminist economics has in common with degrowth approaches, which is also probably true in terms of what it has in common with political ecology, is that we're trying to change that framework. So we're trying to turn around a framework that's focused on production and growth, and more is always better, to standing on the care economy and the reproduction of human beings in our natural environment, right? So as you turn this around, right, from really putting the economy on its head to see what's really important, it's the reproduction of human and natural life. So with that perspective or framework, then we have a common conversation, right? Because we're going to, what are the very values, basic values of human existence as we project out for the next 100 years? And, I think if there's one good thing coming out of the whole COVID pandemic, is that we're starting to give a lot of attention to basic reproduction issues, right? In terms of rethinking healthcare systems, rethinking how we go about scientific discovery, right? And invest our research dollars. Not to mention the questions of inequities, along every single, line, north, south, in terms of, race and class. I mean, all of these have come to the head. Right now, the crisis of physical infrastructure that we've seen in Texas and other places in the past week, have also just sort of screamed out at us that, boy, our priorities have been pretty mixed up for probably the last couple 100 years in terms of what as societies, or governments certainly have considered to be important. So, so I'm optimistic. I think that there's always, out of crisis and struggle, new approaches are born. And I think that we're at a real period now of rethinking, and what we've been contributing from all of these different perspectives in terms of development, or, we're all sort of coming together in a way that we could start to think about the concrete, right? In terms of the day-to-day policies and actions that might move forward towards a major shift. Thanks.
Great. I've really enjoyed this conversation and listening to everyone's talks. And following up on this theme, I guess I was kind of thinking a couple of things to follow up on what Marianne said and then what Carmen said. I also agree with Marianne. I think these frameworks are really helpful for us to have a discussion, but then to also think about how they can evolve over time. And when Carlos was talking, he mentioned, this conflict with wealth and people wanting wealth and all this other thing. I think what we really lack is just even a shared understanding of what wealth is. And that's probably even the wrong term. We shouldn't even use that term. We should go back to more like what is it that we all, what is it that we would like? We would like to have, a food sovereignty for one thing. I mean, there's other things you could think about rather than wealth. So thinking about what is a shared understanding of what's environmental justice, or what's really peace and these other things. And so when I think about, what's the TCD program going to look like in 10 years? What are we going to be talking about? And so I begin to think about what are the gaps in what we're including now and that are emerging as really important issues. I mean, certainly the power differentials, the inequalities, and so forth have been there, but have we put enough focus on them? Have we put enough focus on sort of the financing mechanisms and how to make those, new ideas emerge, and how, we value our resources and things like that, and actually get people to think differently and understand each other when we're talking about some of these concepts. And I think I'll leave it with that. And I guess, I don't know who's next. Glenn, I think you're up.
Well, these are difficult questions to address, but I was thinking in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, that's a grand narrative now. It was adopted by 192 countries around the world. And it includes, a lot of people say the Sustainable Development Goals, more than goals, are aspirations, because they are so broad and certainly quite ambitious. But they do represent, a lot of the incredible challenges that humans and biodiversity and the planet are facing right now. If you think about food security, if you think about gender inequality, if you think about climate change, loss of forests and what's happening to the marine environments and so forth. So from the perspective of a program like the MDP, I totally agree that we need a complete change in paradigm of what we view as important for this planet. I totally agree with the precepts of degrowth, but also there's urgent need to do things now, to make contributions now that can be effective to reduce food insecurity, to reduce carbon emissions, to protect coral reefs and so forth, and on and on and on. All of the things that are represented in the SDGs. One of the really interesting conversations I had with Marianne years ago was, I was a practitioner myself. I worked in forestry projects in South America before I got involved in CATI and more into the academic part. But something that really resonated with me is that she was, I guess it was Betty was saying that when she first started working, it was very focused on the biophysical aspects and biology and so forth. And it was that case for forestry in which I worked. And I was very focused when I worked in Colombia and Peru. I was working in incredibly interesting communities. A lot of them were indigenous communities and so forth. But we were mainly trying to establish plantations to reduce shortages of wood and firewood and so forth. These were denuded landscapes in a lot of cases and so forth. But we did have a sociologist in each of the departments where we were working, but really it's like and this is where I'm going to refer to Marianne. She was invited in the early 80s, I think it was, to a conference to talk about the social part, because it was, nobody talked about the social part at that time when you were working in forestry. And I'm just thinking about how the narratives and the discourses have evolved since then. We have the social, then that led to participation and empowerment, looking much more at the economic dimensions of what we're doing, access to value chains, and how, you can produce something, but then you're going to probably be exploited if you do have it ready for the market. Gender and development emerged, then governance also, and none of these discourses actually replaced the previous discourses. They were like added on. These all have become an integral part of our vision of what, for example, sustainable forestry is. It includes all of these different aspects. And now, most recently, it's this area of complexity, and systems thinking, which is trying to see how these different dimensions really do fit together. And that it's quite challenging, especially, and this is what I tried to refer to in one of my slides, if when you start having this kind of insights into this complexity, it can be overwhelming. So where do I fit in if I'm in a project that can only work in one of these dimensions? But it's important. It's important if you're working in governance or if you're working in the technical aspects, but understanding how this fits in to the bigger picture and not having the false expectation that a very narrow intervention is somehow going to generate some sort of high-level development outcome. So it's an exercise in humility, but also recognizing that if you're doing something positive, with participation, with transparent horizontal consultation and so forth, it's important. And I think that's something that we need. Although we see the need for this great paradigm shift, we also have to understand where we fit in to the world we live in right now and how we can contribute, although to a modest degree, to what's transpiring around the world.
Oh, amazing. Only thanks to Carlos's question and being here together, I realized that from what I know, the last several decades of degrowth emerging, it looks a lot like our party today. It's always a dynamic between activists, practitioners, and intellectuals. And the people at the table are feminist economists and ecofeminists, political ecologists, critical development people. One of the godfathers is Ivan Illich, and conservationists. That's the people involved. Carlos asked what makes degrowth different. I think what makes it different is exactly what Glenn pointed out when he said, because of COVID, our people had to work in the US, but then we conceptualized that with sustainable development, the whole world needs to change. So the turn of degrowth is from saying, we're going to go work with this Amazonian community on conservation or food sovereignty or something, which is very important, to say, in addition, we're going to work on changing the world, the global system. For example, the global food system, driven by the need for profit and accumulation of cash, now has 30% waste. If we had the power, or we could figure out how to reorient it to be driven towards thermodynamic efficiency, we could reduce climate change, we could create nutrition, right? But you can't, that's not something that we're doing in a community in the Amazon. That's something that has to do with powerful political economies, legislations, corporations. And so that's what makes degrowth different. It's the same ideas, it's just turning towards the powerful, to the sources of power. So that gets me to this really interesting question about Korea, right? So people, I've been living off and on in Latin America since the 1980s. Then people were saying, we're struggling because of this damn debt and these juros that we're having to pay to the north, right? And then it was all of this extractivism that quadrupled in just a decade or two, right? The mines, the roads, the oil wells, and then climate change. So people, the idea is these pushes towards accumulation from northern economies are penetrating our territories and our bodies, right? And so degrowth is a way to say, okay, could northern economies draw back in a way that's not incursionando so much, right? But the dilemma is this, what about Korea, right? I'm agnostic. I don't feel like I'm in a position to say, you can bulldoze the Amazon or you can't bulldoze the Amazon. Like, I'm confused about that. So degrowth is basically saying, okay, let's pull out so that my country, my investment, my retirement fund is not investing in a company that's bulldozing the Amazon for my personal benefit, right? That's what I can do in degrowth. And I'm really confused about what to say to people that then have autonomy to use the resources in their own ways. And that's, I don't know, that's a question where I'm opening to you guys.
Let me, sorry, let me ask another question, which is much more pragmatic. In what will be the outcome of COVID? Are we going to see an expansion of extractivism, an expansion of trying to achieve more growth because of the increasing levels of poverty? And what will be, what we should do as critical intellectuals who are worried about all of the impacts in the environment and to peoples of a new round of extractivism in all forms? Or perhaps I am totally out of I'm totally out of focus and we're not going to see an expansion of extractivism.
Are we supposed to go in order again? Yeah, I think again that depends on the context. Following what's happening in Brazil, for example, alongside COVID, you have the rollback of all those socio-environmental policies. And so there's a defunding of all those very successful policies that were brought deforestation down rapidly by 80%. Now it's creeping back up. So the context in Brazil is a very terrible handling of COVID alongside a terrible handling of all the other aspects of policy in that country. So it's impossible to separate it out. And because the government is no longer enforcing a lot of the environmental and social protections, it's all come roaring back. The indigenous people are practically under threat of extinction and so forth, and their territories are not being protected and so forth. So that's an extreme case. I'm sure that there are other countries that are not quite as disheartening. It remains to be seen how much of a political response there will be because of how drastic these changes have been. I don't know.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. I think the question coming out of COVID, certainly in the US, is that the focus is going to be on employment creation. You know, that's what we see in the news now, the whole concern with the millions that are still unemployed here. You know, if we broaden to Latin America, I mean, we're talking about a lot of people, you know, that have lost their sources of livelihoods. And the question is, you know, do we want them to go back, right, when we normalize to doing what they were doing? And I think that the answer is no, right? We want them to be doing different things, you know, things that really serve useful purposes and doing them in new ways. So, you know, to stay with the US example, you know, and just the topic of infrastructure. You know, we know the best way to get people to work is to pour tons of money into rebuilding, you know, the transportation infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, just to name two of them. And, you know, and we need people to go back to work. You know, that in itself is really, you know, that's a more important goal right now because still under capitalism, people have to earn their living, right, if they're going to survive. But then the question is, you know, do we go back to doing infrastructure in the same way that we've always done it, right? And for the same things? No, you know, and luckily, I think that the discussion has advanced far enough in terms of alternative energy sources, the transition been in the news recently to, you know, electric cars, for example, and, you know, what that means. It certainly doesn't reduce energy dependence, but it really puts at the forefront what kind of energy, where you're getting it from, where you produce it. So, so I'm very hopeful that we are at a point where these conversations now they're possible in the political sphere in the US, where maybe they weren't, even 5 years ago, because of the very blatant needs. I'm not sure in terms of Latin America. I don't know to what extent, for example, in Ecuador, people are really thinking about the alternative futures. I don't see it much in the recent campaign, unfortunately, political campaign, in terms of much new thinking about, really alternative models and what to do at the end of the crisis. But, perhaps folks have examples from other countries where they've seen this going on.
Well, I'm an ecologist, but let me just say that, the thing that concerns me is that I am concerned about the growing inequities. And the response to COVID is, the US and European countries and all are going to get the vaccines way ahead of time. They are going to get the economic responses to perhaps help their people way ahead of time. And Latin America and Africa and many parts of Asia are going to be much further behind. And that will put a lot of pressure, I think, on potentially, natural resources. On the other hand, I think that there are these potential new approaches that Marianne put in the chat, these discussions of guaranteed incomes. And people in the sort of the conservation world are talking about conservation-based incomes or universal basic incomes and thinking about new approaches to providing aid that may not be conditional on certain things. And if nothing else, that may have a benefit of trying to alleviate some of the poverty and giving people alternative sort of options. That said, I think that, this may be different from COVID per se, but in the ecological world, we're seeing lots of changes ongoing. We're seeing, we lost the chestnuts, 60, 70 years ago. And then there was Dutch elm disease. And then now the ashes and the hemlocks have, are mostly gone. And the ashes are being, there's all these kinds of changes that are affecting our societies or our ecosystems. And even in the Amazon, at various sites in areas that don't seem to be disturbed, we're seeing big declines in populations of wildlife that are not explained. So there's a lot of dynamics going on here that's complex and maybe context dependent as well, that I think leads us to a lot of uncertainties for the future.
Yeah, maybe I'll try to build on that a little bit. I talked before that the graduates from the MDP program, these are from North American programs, by the way, indicated that a knowledge or skill area that was considered key or quite important is this idea of systems thinking. And it makes me think of one of the pioneers of systems thinking, of course, was Donella Meadows. And she did a talk on leverage points for actually moving a system into a more desirable direction. And it's interesting because the highest leverage point was actually changing people's paradigm of what they think, for example, is important. And I think what's happening in the US now, how we have these different paradigms that are in conflict. And it just makes quite clear how important it is that there is a certain alignment or an agreement about what is important. Because what we've seen now is that we have some people that recognize the importance of climate change. I mean, the problems that we have speaking a bit to Susan, what you were saying, it's like, to a degree, yes, you could turn over certain decisions to, discretionary decisions to certain levels, like a country like Korea and Ecuador. But many of the problems that we're facing as mankind are global in nature and require a certain level of cooperation, global cooperation, things like climate change, or the fact that there's 6 trillion tons or whatever it is of plastics in the ocean. And, the problems go on and on. So I think it is extremely important, whatever we can do on the basis of what we're learning. And we have these amazing people that are graduating from our programs and so forth to contribute to this cultivating a change in mindset or paradigm, because we can plant trees and so forth, but if people aren't convinced of the importance, for example, of trees and forestry and so forth, it's not going to sustain the time. Executive orders can be signed, put into implementation, and then a new leader comes in and they're revoked, which in this case might be a good thing, but in other cases it could be quite negative. So yeah, I think to have these great, enormous changes that we're talking about, we do need these changes in mindset, this change of paradigm. And I think one of the hopeful areas is, I think there has been a growing recognition of the existence of social injustice, the Black Lives Matter movement, the anti-racism. I think all of those things are extremely important and powerful, because I think that can lead to real change when a much greater proportion of the population and so forth recognize the importance of these issues and what's actually happening to society.
These are all tough questions. I'm afraid that I fear with Betty that growing inequality is going to be one of our biggest challenges coming out of a combination of COVID and that political turn that Marianne described in Brazil and that we've lived here. And that's after several decades when inequalities, Gini coefficient measured, were getting worse and worse across the Americas except for Canada. And they started, some Latin American countries started getting more equitable, right, Carmen, in the last 10 years. And that was so hopeful. And I'm really afraid that what's happened now, we've seen just in the past year, right? Stock market investors and billionaires have made a heyday. And what's died are small enterprises, micro enterprises, right? And so we're going to get this situation where we've got mega corporations and then totally disempowered workers, and maybe not much in the middle. And I think in Latin America, people I'm talking to are fearing that that's happening, right? And I think that's a very dangerous situation. And how do we respond to it? There's a lot of ways to respond to it. And I think people are putting together global Green New Deals, Green New Deal for Europe, various Green New Deals for the United States. Latin America, they have the Pacto Social del Sur, Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, and also El Gran Empuje that ECLAC has been pushing, El Gran Empuje Ambiental. And so they've got these kind of multinational movements to make change that include things that you guys have mentioned, right? Infrastructure, basic income. But, I'm not sure, how can we support those? Should we support those? Where does the political and economic power come to support those movements vis-a-vis the billionaires? They seem attractive to me. They seem like positive paths forward, and I'd like to pursue it, but I'm not that confident how.
Thank you. I have one question to Marianne and one to Susan from the audience. The question to Marianne comes from Claudia Romero, and she says, what are the elements that can make a crisis useful? And should I read the question to Susan? It's from Becca Williams. She sort of says, can we have degrowth without provoking violent responses from power holders?
Okay, thank you, Claudia. I can always count on Claudia to ask really difficult questions. And I think she is referring to that adaptive cycle framework because she asked another question too about that. So crises are useful because they lay bare some of the underlying issues that are not so visible when society is humming along. And we just talked about that in terms of COVID, laying bare the inequities at all levels. And so I think, we focused our whole analysis of the Amazon on conflicts because those conflicts revealed power differences, ideological differences, practices, and identities, and how they revealed the key divisions in those societies. So that's how I understand as the elements that make crises useful is the extent to which they lay bare these broader problems, make it easier to see them. And they may also provide opportunities for rethinking because of that. So we've just talked about that vis-a-vis COVID, to the extent that crises show these stark problems and pose them as problems that have to be solved because we're in a crisis situation. It does open up the possibility of new pathways.
Becky Williams, I can't believe that you think any power holders are going to resist transforming our world to make it healthier and more fair and more green. How can they say no? Yeah, there's a lot of fear. It's so sad because, sure, big power holders who have benefited most from capital accumulation and growth resist, but all kinds of people who are being exploited and suffering, whose bodies and environments have been raped by these processes, are also resisting to change and saying, capitalist growth is my freedom and don't touch it, right? So it's a really complicated change. And I don't have my theory is to do it on all fronts simultaneously. Some people need to do stuff that provokes violent resistance. Other people find sophisticated ways to use scientific and rational arguments to and then other ways to make alliances. Change is hard. Change is hard, and there's going to be resistance from people in every corner. So that's why we need all of us working together from different points.
Thank you. Does anybody want to add something to the questions that were asked? Well, this has been a very enlightening and fantastic and very stimulating panel. I want to thank all of you for how you prepare for this and for your wisdom and showing the history of these debates at the center. And thanks so much. This was, I think, the best way to celebrate the history of the center, not only with a director's panel, but also a panel about the intellectual debates, contributions, and ways of forming students and teaching new generations how to be good development practitioners and citizens. So thanks so much to all of you, and thanks to everybody who attended the event virtually. Unfortunately, we cannot have a party after this, but that's life under COVID. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos.
You.
Thank you.